A $600 pension 10, 15 years ago won't buy much of anything here today.
And why the millennial generation is starting to give up because they can't afford to get a good job or own a house.
8 million Venezuelans voting for this assembly, saying it's actually less than 3.
It is. And people are going to start rioting in the streets.
Was reported to have asked Putin for military support that would help him stay in power.
We will make America safe again. And yes, together, we will make America great again.
And they ignore him. And 8 more years goes by till Bernie himself finally admits to his sons, hey, I've been running a Ponzi scheme.
Does its dominance mean it can use the alliance for its own ends?
Since 1981, bond yields, also known as coupon rates, have just gone down and down and down.
The Federal Reserve note will be your biggest financial liability.
RTD Live Talk. We're live. It's Monday afternoon, the 22nd day of the month of October, and today I'm excited to have a special guest joining us. And so, as always, want to give everybody a second to log in and to chime in, let me know where you're watching us from. So my name is Mike, RTD, host, Detroit's #1 YouTube talk show, and today is going to be a special opportunity for you guys, the audience, to call in or via chat, ask any questions you have in relation to the markets, maybe a little geopolitical type events, as well as get his thoughts on cryptocurrency. And more importantly, I'm interested in finding out, I've watched a couple of videos from Mr. Rick Rule in reference to what's happening in the uranium sector. So definitely want to be educated in that department as well. So let's actually get right into today's interview. Don't want to waste any time. So today I have Mr. Rick Rule. Welcome to RTD Live Talk.
Mike, it's certainly a pleasure to be with you. Thank you for having me on. I'm a fan of your channel.
Well, thank you for taking time, first of all, to sit down with us and share what's happening in your world, as well as your thoughts and opinions on what's happening around this world for most part. So I want to dive in right away with some questions. And the first question that I have a long list, so I want to make sure I get to many as I can. And the first question that I have for you is, what are some things that have Rick Rule concerned with the markets or just the overall geopolitical events happening around the world right now?
Well, I'm sad to say that a list of geopolitical events is probably too long to calculate. The sort of continued appeal of politics itself as a way of governing relationships between people, I think, is very unfortunate. I wish there was more person-to-person contact, more voluntary interaction, and less banding together as political groups. That is, if you will, in the United States, less Republican activity, less Democratic activity, and more human-to-human, person-to-person activity. But moving beyond the generalities, going back to the first part of your question, which I'm probably more competent to answer, I would say that 4 things have me concerned about financial markets. The first is that the economic expansion that we're enjoying today is fairly long of tooth. By most people's measurements, it began in 2009, which means that the expansion that we're currently enjoying has been going on for 9 years. In my own experience, I came into financial markets in the early part of the decade of the 1970s. It is rare that an economic expansion lasts for this period of time. The second thing that I'm concerned about is that it would appear that we are beginning the end of a very long period, a 30-year period of progressively lower interest rates. And while I believe that markets should set rates, higher rates of interest traditionally have depressed yields on financial assets, including already issued bonds and, of course, equities, while simultaneously raising the cost of capital for both investors and consumers. If you look from a longer-term viewpoint, one would suggest that we've been in a bond bull market since 1982, when the interest rate, if I remember correctly, on the U.S. 10-year Treasury peaked at 15.6. So certainly a period where interest rates rose, while it needs to happen, could be problematic for financial markets. The third thing that concerns me is something that you've done a great job publicizing for a very long time on your channel, which is, and I'm going to confine these remarks to the United States, the market that I know best, but the aggregate levels of debt relative to the ability of the private economy to service those debts. Debts on the federal level, as I understand it, are on balance sheet around $21 trillion. Off balance sheet liabilities, promises made to people on the federal level, according to the Congressional Budget Office, are about $120 trillion. Those members of your audience who are looking at my face on this video will understand what an unfunded liability looks like, because I'm a 65-year-old entitled, oddly, that's the phrase, to receive things like Medicare, Social Security, all those types of things. Then, of course, there are the unfunded on-balance sheet and off-balance sheet liabilities at the federal level and the state level. In addition to that, an amount that has been reliably estimated, I think, with regards to unfunded public and private pension liabilities, that totals in the range of $5 trillion. The economic stimulus that we enjoyed as a society as a consequence of borrowing all this money over the last 35 years, at some point in time becomes a tremendous mortgage that either we or our born and unborn children have to pay off. To the extent that interest rates rise enough to compensate savers for the risk associated with either a formal default, that is the government deciding it can't pay off its debt, or what I believe to be an informal default, where we do as we did in the 70s and inflate away the net present value of the obligation, I'm afraid could be very, very disruptive to markets.
Yeah.
Oddly, I need to say that despite all of that, I'm a long-term optimist. I lived through and invested through the decade of the 1970s, which was an extremely tumultuous time. And somehow, some way, we survived it. The truth is, we have an amazingly innovative economy. The United States is still a place where 4 or 5 young, pimply-faced college students in some place like Sunnyvale, California, can commandeer a garage and out pops Apple or out pops Google.
Yeah.
The question is to give ourselves enough respite from government that the ascent of man, the efforts of private individuals generate enough wealth to undo some of the damage that we seem to have done ourselves in the last 35 years. And I'm sorry for that long-winded answer. No. But it's a question I think about all the time.
Yeah, not a problem. I appreciate you elaborating on it. Now, one of the things you hinted at earlier on was about bonds. And so what are your thoughts on the idea that a lot of economists and more people are coming out with using an indicator of, the yield curve inverting and the possibilities of a recession? What are your thoughts about that? Is that something that should be relied upon based upon trends of what prior recessions, how they began?
Certainly, if past is prologue, it has to be very, very worrying. I think it's arguable that the economic recovery that we have been experiencing of late has more to do with liquidity, that is, cash in the system, than solvency. Many people confuse liquidity and solvency. A person that has $10,000 in his pocket but $1 million mortgage doesn't have a problem until he does.
Right.
And that may be the circumstance that confronts us now. Certainly, I think you see a situation where with the 30-year fixed mortgage rate topping 5% again, that housing for many people will become less and less affordable, which of course will impact the construction trades and the building materials businesses. I would suggest certainly that pricing capital in debt markets, or the increasing price of capital in debt markets, will raise costs throughout the economic chain and could, I'm not an economist, but could derail the expansion that so many people have enjoyed for the last 9 years.
Yeah. Now, another thing I wanted to touch on is the stock market. Over the last couple of weeks especially, there's been a 1,100 point drop, and then it goes up 300-400. It's been a lot of volatility in the stock market. And of course, whenever there's a lot of volatility, a lot of people are concerned and cautious, and investors are. There's a lot at stake if there's another correction. What are your thoughts on all this volatility? Is it something we should be concerned about?
I'm sorry?
I'm sorry. Okay, sorry about that. It looks like the computer froze. But I was talking about the stock market volatility over the last couple of weeks. Is that something that is of concern to you?
It isn't. I consider volatility to be a tool rather than a risk. From my own standpoint, as things become more volatile, it just means that more assets that I'd like to buy become cheaper. You need to understand, of course, that I'm probably the exception rather than the rule with regards to that. I would also point out, and I'm not suggesting to you that the stock market is undervalued, but I am suggesting to you that with the aggregate levels of the stock market so high compared to the levels that people experienced 20 years ago, that an 1,100 point drop is, as a percentage of the total, much less impactful than it used to be. I'm unconcerned personally about volatility. I am very concerned personally about the fact that many investors are confusing liquidity, that is cash in the system, for solvency. That is our ability to ultimately service our debts and our obligations to each other.
Interesting. Now, so just because we're streaming live, so I want to make sure those that are tuning in now. So welcome to RTD Live Talk. Today I have a special guest, Mr. Rick Rule, President and CEO of Sprott U.S. Holdings, joining us. And so he's a long-term guest. We had you on actually I think it was about a year ago, 2 years ago. And at that point, that's another segment. I want to, at that point, President Donald Trump was just newly elected as president. So what are your thoughts on how would you grade him based upon how either helpful or harmful he's been for the markets or the economy in general? Because, he's still spewing information saying that, unemployment is at all-time lows and the stock market is at all-time highs. And so he's, picking up on a narrative that he ran against as a presidential candidate. So what are your thoughts on President Trump at this current moment? What grade would you give him based upon his promises?
Well, I need to preface this by saying that I'm a voluntarist, a libertarian. So I don't have any particular use for either Democrats or Republicans or politicians of any stripe.
Right.
I think that the president is a particularly ungracious and ungraceful human being. So, I need to say that personally, I find him distasteful. Certainly anybody who enacts a tax cut as an old rich guy is somebody who is doing me a favor.
Yeah.
But the fact that the tax cut has not been matched by reduced spending seems to me to suggest that there's going to be an intergenerational transfer. That is, people your age are beginning to subsidize people my age, which if I were your age, I wouldn't particularly like.
Yeah.
The one thing that I will say that I grudgingly support about our president is that he has done really the best job in many, many, many years in constraining the growth of the new regulations that have themselves had a very dampening effect on the economy for many years. So if you I can't give him an overall grade, I'm afraid, but certainly his approach to the regulatory environment, I would give him an A. His conduct of foreign policy and his flight to populist protectionist narratives, which of course are attacks on consumers worldwide, I would give him an F. In a fiscal sense, the fact that he's prepared to leave more money in my pockets is useful to me, but understand expanding the deficit means he's taking more money from your pocket.
Yeah.
And I would urge you to give him a D at best in that regard. I will also say that all of us, for some strange reason, give politicians both the praise and the blame for things that are very often largely out of their control. I would suggest to you as an example that one of the reasons for the economic expansion that we've enjoyed is that we came off a fairly low base as a consequence of the global financial crisis of 2008. And attempts by Mr. Obama or Mr. Trump to claim the credit for the hard work and the ingenuity and the inventiveness of the American people is probably misguided from my point of view. I think your listeners have more to do with what's good in the United States than either Mr. Obama or Mr. Trump.
Right. Now, speaking of the tax cuts, just I think it was over this weekend or last couple of days, there was mention of another tax cut right before the midterm election. So I'm assuming that in the next couple of weeks, they're going to try to roll out something, which seems like a sway to get some last minute votes or whatnot. So what are your thoughts on the idea that now he's going to give the so-called the middle class a tax cut? I'm assuming it's some type of political, propaganda, but yeah, what are your thoughts on that? That he might talk about cutting taxes for the middle class as well?
I think you hit the nail on the head. One of the great American political philosophers, in my experience, has been H.L. Mencken, who said that you understand elections best if you understand them as advanced auctions of stolen property. A tax cut that you don't pay for by reducing spending is merely a transfer of wealth from young people to old people. As an old person, of course, I benefit from it, but I'm still hardly in favor of it.
Yeah, interesting there. So let's keep moving. This is going pretty well. As always, guys, you guys are turning in. If you have any questions, feel free to pose those questions in the chat. I can ask directly or give us a call, 1-833-LIVE-RTD, and you can ask directly yourself if you're interested. So I want to keep moving. There's a lot of geopolitical stuff going on, which, of course, will, I think, end up being another tax on consumers, ideally this trade war. And so what are your thoughts on the Chinese, as well as the U.S. back and forth trade war, all these tariffs that's being passed? Where will this end? How will this play out next couple of months or years? What are your thoughts on that?
That's above my pay grade, I'm afraid, only to suggest that the trade wars make everyone poorer on balance. The whole suggestion that any of these discussions have to do with free trade is silly. You and I could author a free trade agreement on this call. We would agree to a paragraph that said that there will be no barriers to purchases and sales between consenting peoples, and that would be the end of it. The fact that, as an example, the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, was amended by adding 1,200 pages to what was already a 3,600-page long document tells you exactly how free it is. And that's the same situation between the United States and China. Remember that my former statement that elections are advanced auctions of stolen property. The truth is that the political class in China is trying to favor certain parts of their constituency the same way that Trump is trying to favor certain parts of his constituency, to the extent, to the detriment of consumers and taxpayers in both countries.
All right, interesting there. Now, I'm curious to get your thoughts on. There's a lot of this in the news lately.
Something on the web about the 3,600
Okay, no problem. So I want to get your thoughts on this migrant crisis that's happening down in Honduras. And so it looks like one of the plans has always been to cause chaos in bordering countries and have an influx of migrants seeking freedom and opportunity. And so there's, thousands of people marching through Honduras, Guatemala, and they're right now at the Mexican border trying to get into Mexico to get into the U.S. What is up with that, and how would that impact our economy here, given the fact that there's already a lot of people mad about what's happening with the border and the walls?
Boy, your audience is going to go from sort of disliking me to despising me. I'm afraid as a consequence of this question. My great-grandfather was an illegal immigrant to the United States. He was Italian, and he was referred to when he came as a WAP, which means he came without papers. It worked out pretty well for my family, and in fairness, I think it worked out fairly well for the country. We're a nation based on immigrants. Now, were I president, an extremely unlikely outcome, my own temptation would be to eliminate for a very long period of time the ability of immigrants, legal or illegal, from claiming any sort of social benefit.
Yeah.
I certainly believe to the extent possible in the free migration of people. And in one sense, the flow of immigrants, illegal immigrants across our southern border speaks volumes about the superiority historically of the American political system. People are fleeing from places that are less free and less rich to a place that is more free and more rich. And one can't blame them for doing that. At the same time, I don't think that people in this country have any particular obligation to feed or house them, at least on a public basis. To the extent that people wanted to do that privately, that's of course their business. And just to make myself more unpopular with your listeners or viewers, I'm not sure that we have, or I have, any particular